December 8, 1980. Sussex, England, 30:47 a.m. The phone shattered the silence like a gunshot. Paul McCartney was deep in sleep, the kind of sleep that comes after a long day in the studio, after hours of laying down tracks, after the satisfying exhaustion of creation. His wife Linda stirred beside him. The phone kept ringing. Nobody calls at this hour with good news. He reached for the receiver in the darkness, his fingers fumbling against the cold plastic. The voice on the other end belonged to his manager. The words that followed would divide his life into two parts: before this call and after. John Lennon had been shot. John Lennon was dead. For a moment, Paul said nothing. The room seemed to tilt. Linda was awake now, watching him, sensing something terrible in the stillness of his face. Outside, the English countryside slept peacefully, unaware that the world had just changed forever. But what Paul said next would haunt him for decades. And that story begins not in 1980, but 23 years earlier, on a summer afternoon that smelled of freshly cut grass and possibility. July 6, 1957, Liverpool. The Woolton Parish Church was holding its annual garden festival. A skiffle band called the Quarrymen was playing on a makeshift stage. Their leader was a 16-year-old troublemaker named John Lennon. Sideburns, leather jacket, attitude for days. In the crowd stood a 15-year-old boy named Paul McCartney. Paul watched John perform. There was something magnetic about him, something dangerous. John was playing songs he barely knew, making up lyrics when he forgot them, turning mistakes into style. He wasn't technically skilled, but he had presence, the kind that made you unable to look away. After the set, a mutual friend introduced them. Paul picked up a guitar and played Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock, note perfect. Every word memorized. Then he showed John how to properly tune his instrument. John faced a decision. Here was a kid younger than him, clearly more talented. Bringing him into the band would mean sharing the spotlight. It would mean admitting he needed help. It took John 2 weeks to make the call. Do you want to join the group? 6 words that changed the history of music. But what nobody talks about is why these two boys connected so deeply, so quickly. The answer lay in something they shared, something painful, something they rarely discussed with anyone else. Both had lost their mothers. Paul's mother Mary died in breast cancer. Paul was 14 years old. He remembers coming home from school, his father sitting him down, the words that made no sense. His mother was gone, just like that. No warning, no goodbye. He didn't cry, not that day, not at the funeral, not for months afterward. The grief went somewhere deep inside him, locked in a room he couldn't access. It would take him 20 years to finally let it out. When John's mother Julia died in 1958, hit by a car driven by an off-duty police officer, something clicked between the two boys. They never talked about it directly. British boys didn't do that. But they knew, they understood each other in a way that required no words. Two motherless sons, two wounded dies, finding family in each other. This is the foundation people forget when they talk about Lennon and McCartney. Before they were songwriting partners, before they were rivals, before they were enemies, they were two kids who had learned too young that the people you love can disappear without warning. And that fear, the fear of abandonment, the fear of loss, would shape everything that came after. The Beatles' years were a hurricane. There's no other way to describe it. Between 1962 and 1970, 4 young men from Liverpool became the most famous human beings on the planet. They changed music, fashion, culture, language. They were chased through airports, mobbed in hotels, screamed at so loudly during concerts that they couldn't hear themselves play. At the center of it all, John and Paul. They wrote songs together in hotel rooms, on tour buses, in the back of cars. They developed a shorthand that bordered on telepathy. When one got stuck, the other would unstick him. When one wrote a verse, the other would add the chorus. They pushed each other, challenged each other, drove each other to heights neither could have reached alone. But they also competed fiercely. Anything you can do, I can do better. That was the unspoken rule. If John wrote something brilliant, Paul had to respond with something even more brilliant. If Paul crafted a perfect melody, John had to craft a more daring one. This competition made them better. but it also planted seeds of resentment. By 1968, the cracks were showing. The band was fracturing under the weight of fame, money, creative differences, and one woman named Yoko Ono. Paul felt John slipping away. The partnership that had defined his life was dissolving, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He pushed for organization. He attempted to steer the ship, but the more he pushed, the more the others resisted. They saw his leadership as control, his concern as condescension. George Harrison quit temporarily. Ringo had already quit once before. John was there physically but absent mentally, his attention fixed on Yoko, who sat beside him through every session like a silent witness to the end. There's a moment in the footage that breaks your heart if you know what to look for. Paul is at the piano, trying to work through a song. He looks up at John, searching for the connection they once had. John stares back, but his eyes are empty. The bridge between them has collapsed. The rooftop concert on January 3, 1969 was the last time the Beatles performed together in public. 42 minutes of music on a cold London rooftop, police threatening to shut them down, passers-by on the street staring up in disbelief. When it was over, John said into the microphone, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we passed the audition." A joke, but also a goodbye. April 10, 1970. Paul McCartney publicly announced that the Beatles were finished. The world blamed him. He was the one who made it official. He was the one who filed the lawsuit to dissolve the partnership. In the court of public opinion, Paul was the villain who killed the band everyone loved. But Paul saw it differently. He wasn't killing the Beatles. He was refusing to pretend they still existed. The others had already left in everything but name. John had privately told them months earlier that he wanted out. Paul just had the courage, or perhaps the desperation, to say it publicly. The lawsuit was brutal. Brothers fighting over money, over songs, over legacy. Alan Klein versus the Eastmans. John, George and Ringo on one side. Paul alone on the other. 3 against 1. The loneliest number. Paul fell into a depression. He stopped shaving. He started drinking more than he should. He stayed in bed for days at a time. The man who had been Paul McCartney, charming, confident, the cute Beatles, seemed to evaporate. Linda saved him. She pulled him out of bed. She put a guitar in his hands. She reminded him that he was more than just a Beatle. But the rift with John, that showed no signs of healing. 1971 brought the cruelest cut. John released an album called Imagine. On it was a song called How Do You Sleep? Every lyric was a dagger aimed directly at Paul. The song mocked his music. It dismissed his talent. It accused him of surrounding himself with yes men and producing nothing of value. George Harrison even played guitar on the track, a detail that stung almost as much as the lyrics themselves. Paul heard the song. He said nothing publicly, but friends reported that he was devastated. This wasn't a stranger attacking him. This was John, the boy he'd met at the church fair, the partner who had shared his dreams, the closest thing he had to a brother. How do you respond when your best friend turns your shared history into ammunition? Paul chose silence. He focused on Wings, his new band. He toured, he recorded, he tried to build a life outside the shadow of the Beatles, but the wound never fully closed. As the decade progressed, something shifted. By 1975, the anger began to fade. John had split from Yoko briefly, gone through his infamous Lost Weekend, and emerged with a new perspective. Paul had proven himself as a solo artist, racking up hits that matched anything from the Beatles' years. They started talking again. Phone calls at first, awkward, tentative conversations that gradually became easier. John was taking a break from music, staying home to raise his son Sean. When Paul visited New York, he sometimes dropped by the Dakota building where John lived. They would sit in John's kitchen and talk, not about the old days but about the present, about children, about baking bread, about the ordinary pleasures of life. The last time I spoke to John, Paul would later recall, we just talked about kids, about bread. He'd started baking bread, and we were just talking about the simple things. Simple things, normal things, the kind of things that old friends discuss when they've finally put the battles behind them. But they never had the conversation that mattered most. They never said the words that had gone unspoken for too long. I love you. I forgive you. I'm sorry. The words stayed trapped in the space between them, waiting for a future conversation that would never come. And that brings us back to December 8, 1980. John Lennon spent his last day being photographed by Annie Leibov. The famous image, John naked, curled around Yoko, vulnerable and loving. He signed a copy of his new album for a young man named Mark David Chapman. That evening around 10:50 p.m. New York time, John and Yoko returned to the Dakota from a recording session. Chapman was waiting in the shadow. 5 bullets. 4 of them found their target. John Lennon was pronounced dead at Roosevelt Hospital at 11:07 p.m. Across the Atlantic it was nearly 4 a.m. when the phone rang in Paul's Sussex farmhouse. He listened to the words. He put down the phone, and then Paul McCartney said something that would be misunderstood for years to come. "It's a drag." That's what he told reporters the next day when they ambushed him outside his home. Cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his face, everyone wanting a piece of his grief. It's a drag. The world was appalled. How could he be so cold? How could he reduce the death of John Lennon to something so casual, so dismissive? The headlines screamed. The fans raged. Paul McCartney didn't care that his partner was dead. But here's what they didn't understand. Paul was in shock. Complete, dissociative shock. The same kind of shock that had frozen him when his mother died 24 years earlier. The same protective numbness that had kept him from crying at her funeral. He didn't know what to say. The cameras caught him at his most vulnerable, his most broken, and they interpreted his paralysis as indifference. "I can't express myself very well," he tried to explain later. "It was so difficult. I couldn't take it in. I just went numb." Behind closed doors, away from the cameras, the truth was different. Linda held him while he sobbed. He couldn't stop thinking about all the things he never said, all the conversations they never finished, all the time they wasted being angry. "We never got to complete our relationship," Paul would say years later. "We were still in the middle of it. The middle, not the end. The middle. That's what death does. It freezes relationships in whatever state they happen to be in. No more growth, no more healing, no more chance." In the weeks and months that followed, Paul struggled to process his grief. He wrote a song called Here Today, a letter to John that he could never send. In it he finally said the things he couldn't say while John was alive. He acknowledged the complexity of their relationship. He admitted his love. He wrestled with the absurdity of death cutting short a conversation that wasn't finished. Recording the song, Paul broke down multiple times. His voice cracked. His hands trembled on the guitar. It was the closest he could come to completing what had been left incomplete. But was it enough? The question that haunted Paul McCartney for decades wasn't about the music. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about who wrote what, or who deserved credit. The question was simpler, and more devastating. Did John know? Did John know how much Paul loved him? Did John understand that beneath all the lawsuits, and the arguments, and the public accusations, there was a bond that nothing could truly break? Did John know that Paul still thought of him as the brother he'd chosen, the partner who'd changed his life, the friend he missed every single day? Paul thought they had time. People always think they have time. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m., and time ran out. In the years since John's death, Paul has kept his memory alive in countless ways. He plays Beatles songs at every concert, introducing them with stories about John. He speaks about their partnership with a tenderness that surprises people who remember the bitter years. He's made peace with Yoko Ono. He's embraced John's legacy as part of his own. And in 2023 something remarkable happened. Using artificial intelligence, producers managed to isolate John's voice from an old demo tape recorded in the technology that didn't exist in the 1990s, when they first tried to complete the song, had finally caught up. Paul, Ringo, and George, through previously recorded guitar parts, finished the track. It was called Now and Then, the last Beatles song. 43 years after the band broke up, 53 years after they first walked into Abbey Road studio. When Paul heard John's voice singing the lyrics, "Now and then, I miss you," he wept. It was as close to a conversation as he would ever get again. He still performs Here Today almost every night, still choking up when he reaches the final verse. When interviewers ask about John, Paul's eyes change. The polished showman disappears. What remains is a boy from Liverpool, who lost too many people too soon. His mother, his best friend, his brother in all but blood. "I miss him," Paul says simply. "Every day, I miss him." But here's what Paul McCartney learned, what he spent 44 years learning. Grief doesn't go away, it just changes shape. Some days it's a wave, some days it's an ocean, and some days, if you're lucky, it's a song you can sing to keep the person alive. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. on a December morning. A voice delivered the worst news imaginable, and in that moment, Paul McCartney joined the millions of people throughout history who have learned the hardest lesson. Tell them now. Whatever you need to say it now, because the phone might ring tonight, and the person you meant to call might not be there to answer. John Lennon is gone, but in every concert, in every song, in every memory Paul carries, John is still there, still pushing him, still challenging him, still waiting for the conversation they never finished. Some stories don't have endings. This is one of them.